In 1194, the town of Chartres in France burned so completely that most of its people believed their cathedral was gone forever, reduced to nothing but ash, along with the rest of the city. Yet when the fire finally died and the smoke cleared 3 days later, something was found inside the ruins that changed everything. A sacred relic, a piece of cloth believed to belong to the Virgin Mary, still intact without a single scorch mark. And the reaction recorded by medieval chroniclers was not confusion or relief, but certainty, a shared conclusion that this was not chance, but instruction, not survival, but a signal, and that signal carried a clear demand: rebuild, but not as before, build something worthy of what had been preserved. What followed was not just reconstruction, but escalation, because within roughly 26 years, a structure rose that even today challenges modern engineering assumptions, a building so precise in its proportions and so consistent in its internal behavior that scientists centuries later would begin measuring it and realize that something far more complex was happening inside than architecture alone could explain. Because when you enter the space, your body reacts before your mind has time to interpret it, not emotionally and not symbolically, but physically measurably in ways that can be tracked and recorded. I did not begin this investigation through religion or history, but through a different doorway entirely, because a friend of mine studies how sound interacts with the human body, and she mentioned one afternoon, almost casually, that certain ancient stone structures produce frequency ranges that modern concert halls are intentionally designed to replicate frequencies that are not simply heard but felt, frequencies that alter heart rate, breathing patterns, and brain activity. And when I asked her which structures she was referring to, she named 3 Gothic cathedrals and 1 prehistoric stone circle, Stonehenge, and that was enough to suggest a pattern that could not be dismissed. Over the next 8 months, I tried to understand what connected them, expecting at first to find symbolic meaning or ritual explanation, but what emerged instead was engineering consistent, repeatable, and far more deliberate than the official narrative suggests, because once you begin to understand how these buildings actually function, the story we have been given starts to feel incomplete in a very specific way. The word cathedral comes from the Latin cathedra, meaning a seat, specifically the seat of a bishop, and the standard explanation tells us these buildings were constructed as expressions of religious devotion, as houses of worship, as monuments to faith and authority. And while that is true, it is only a partial description of what they were, because there is another function rarely discussed, almost entirely absent from modern historical framing, yet supported by physical evidence that can be measured today. They were hospitals, not metaphorically, but functionally, and the clue is embedded in language itself, because the root cath traces back to the Greek katharos, meaning to cleanse or purify, the same root that gives us catharsis, the release described by Aristotle when emotional tension is discharged. And in the ancient world, these ideas were not separated into psychological and physical categories the way we separate them now. Purification of the mind and purification of the body were understood as the same process achieved through the same environment. The great Gothic cathedrals of Europe were not constructed by faith alone, but by guilds, and those guilds were not simply groups of laborers following religious instruction, but highly organized systems of knowledge transmission holding practical understanding of geometry, acoustics, material behavior, and the interaction between built space and the human nervous system, and the people within these systems were trained through long apprenticeships that could last 7 years or more, not through written manuals, but through direct observation and repetition, passing knowledge from one generation to the next in a continuous chain that was never fully recorded. These builders were known as Freemasons, not in the symbolic or modern sense, but in the technical sense, because they worked with freestone a material that could be cut in any direction, allowing for precision construction that exceeded what most other stone types could achieve. Yet the term free also reflected something else, because these builders were not bound to a single lord or location. They moved between cities and regions, carrying their knowledge with them and applying it wherever large-scale construction was commissioned, which allowed techniques to spread and evolve over time. This system produced results that are now measurable, because when modern researchers began analyzing the acoustic properties of structures like Chartres Cathedral, they found that while the overall reverberation time of about 5 seconds is not unusual for a large stone building, the distribution of frequencies within that reverberation is highly unusual, because the structure does not amplify all sound equally, but instead reinforces a narrow band between approximately 40 and 60 Hz, a range so low that it is often felt more than heard. And this is where the modern data becomes difficult to ignore, because neurological research over the past 2 decades has identified this same frequency range as being associated with the theta state of brain activity, a state linked to deep relaxation, reduced cortisol production, and measurable decreases in perceived pain, which means that the building is not simply creating an atmosphere, but actively influencing the physiological condition of the people inside it. At that point, the question changes, because it is no longer about whether these effects exist, but whether they were intentional. And once you begin to compare multiple structures and find the same patterns repeated with precision, the idea of coincidence becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. If this effect inside Chartres were accidental, it would be one of the most precise accidents in architectural history, because when researchers expanded their analysis across multiple Gothic cathedrals, they found the same pattern repeating with consistency that suggests intention rather than coincidence. And this is where the structure begins to reveal its function not as symbolism, but as measurable design. The flying buttress is usually explained as a structural innovation that allowed taller walls and larger windows, but when acoustic engineers studied how sound behaves inside these spaces, they discovered that the buttresses are also shaping energy, redirecting sound waves back into the interior instead of allowing them to dissipate outward, creating a contained acoustic environment where certain frequencies are reinforced while others are reduced, forming a stable resonance that continuously interacts with the human body. This observation aligns with modern research in archaeoacoustics, including the work of Rupert Till, whose studies of ancient structures revealed the presence of standing wave zones where sound energy accumulates and produces physical effects depending on position within the space. And when those findings are compared with neurological data, the overlap becomes difficult to dismiss, because the same low-frequency ranges observed in these buildings correspond to states associated with relaxation, reduced stress, and altered perception. What makes this more compelling is that medieval builders had no instruments to measure frequency or amplitude, yet the results they achieved fall directly within ranges that modern science now identifies as biologically significant, which suggests that their knowledge was not theoretical but empirical, refined through generations of observation, where builders watched how people responded inside different structures and adjusted their designs accordingly. Sound, however, was only one layer, because the second layer was light, specifically the light filtered through stained glass, which is often described as decorative or educational, but the materials used tell a different story, since the pigments that created the deep reds and blues were chemically specific, and these colors filter light into distinct wavelengths that interact with the human body in measurable ways. Modern research shows that different wavelengths of light influence hormonal systems, with red light associated with pathways linked to serotonin and blue light affecting melatonin regulation, which means the interior of a cathedral is not illuminated by neutral daylight but by a modified spectrum that shifts throughout the day, creating an environment where light is continuously interacting with biological processes. There is also a third component that is rarely included in architectural discussions, which is chemistry, because for centuries, religious services involved the burning of incense, particularly frankincense, and modern studies have shown that compounds released from this resin interact with receptors in the brain associated with anxiety reduction and pain modulation, meaning that the air itself inside these spaces was part of the overall system rather than an incidental detail. When these elements are considered together, sound influencing brainwave activity, light affecting hormonal balance, and airborne compounds altering neurological response, the cathedral begins to appear less like a symbolic space and more like a controlled environment designed to produce consistent physiological effects, and this is where the historical explanation starts to feel incomplete. This becomes even harder to ignore when you examine how these structures functioned within medieval society, because they were not isolated buildings but central components of larger complexes that included medicinal gardens, housing for the sick, and systems for sanitation, forming an integrated network of care that existed long before modern hospitals. And at the center of that network was always the cathedral itself, the space where all of these environmental factors were concentrated, which leads to a question that becomes increasingly difficult to avoid, because if these buildings were designed to influence the human body in measurable ways, and if the builders understood these effects through observation refined over generations, then the issue is no longer whether cathedrals had a healing function, but why that function is almost entirely missing from the way history describes them today. And that is where the story begins to shift, because the disappearance of this knowledge does not appear to have been gradual. It aligns with a series of political and economic changes that systematically dismantled the institutions responsible for creating and maintaining it. The shift becomes impossible to ignore when you look at what happened in the 16th century, because the disappearance of this knowledge does not align with natural decline or gradual loss. It aligns with a series of deliberate actions that dismantled the very system responsible for preserving and transmitting it, and the most significant of those actions began under Henry VIII between 1536 and 1541. This period is usually described as a religious and political transformation, the break from Rome, the consolidation of royal authority, the redistribution of land. But it was also something else that is rarely emphasized: the destruction of an entire infrastructure that had operated continuously for centuries, because the dissolution of the monasteries did not just remove religious institutions, it removed the network that supported healthcare, education, and knowledge transmission across England. At the time this process began, England had hundreds of religious hospitals, with historical estimates placing the number at around 500 functioning institutions by the early 16th century, and within less than 2 decades, that number collapsed to fewer than 50, meaning that approximately 90% of the existing medical infrastructure disappeared in a single generation. And this was not a side effect, but a direct consequence of policy decisions that seized land, dissolved organizations, and displaced the people who operated them. What vanished along with these institutions was not only physical space, but accumulated knowledge, because these monastic complexes were not isolated religious centers. They were integrated systems that included medicinal gardens, practical treatment methods, and long-term observational records of how environment affects the human body. And at the center of these systems was always the cathedral itself, the structure where sound, light, and spatial geometry converged to produce measurable effects. The official narrative frames this transition as progress, as the movement from medieval superstition toward rational modern systems. But when you examine the timeline more closely, something does not align, because the destruction of these institutions occurred centuries before modern medicine had developed the tools to replace what was lost, which means that for a significant period of time, a functioning system of care was removed without an equivalent system ready to take its place. This pattern was not limited to England because similar transformations occurred across Europe over the following 2 centuries as centralized states expanded control over land labor and production, and as part of that process, the guild system that had preserved technical knowledge began to be dismantled, restricted, or absorbed into new economic structures that prioritized wage labor and standardized production over long-term apprenticeship and generational knowledge transfer. Guilds had operated under a fundamentally different model, where knowledge was held collectively transmitted directly through experience and protected from external access. But as legal frameworks evolved, particularly with the emergence of early intellectual property laws, knowledge began to shift from a shared resource into something that could be owned, controlled, and monetized, fundamentally changing how information was preserved and distributed. This transition is often described as innovation, but it also had a consequence that is rarely addressed because systems built on collective memory and long-term observation do not translate easily into written documentation or fragmented ownership, and when those systems are disrupted, the knowledge they carry does not simply relocate, it disappears. At the same time that guilds were being suppressed, the function of cathedrals began to change, not in their physical structure, but in how they were used, because without the surrounding monastic systems and without the builders who understood their full capabilities, these buildings were gradually reduced to purely symbolic roles, their measurable effects no longer recognized as part of their purpose, and over time, that original function faded from recorded history. By the 18th and 19th centuries, when many of the historical accounts we rely on today were written, the intellectual framework had already shifted toward industrial thinking, where value was assigned to machines' production and observable mechanics. And within that framework, the idea that a stone building could influence the human nervous system through sound, light, and environment did not fit, so it was either ignored or reinterpreted as symbolic or spiritual rather than functional. And yet the physical evidence remained because the buildings themselves did not change. Their acoustic properties remained measurable, their interaction with light remained consistent, and their structural precision continued to challenge modern assumptions, creating a disconnect between what could be observed and what was officially explained. This raises a question that becomes more difficult the deeper you look into it, because if the knowledge required to create these effects existed, and if it was preserved within systems that were systematically dismantled during a period of political and economic consolidation, then the loss of that knowledge may not have been accidental at all, but a consequence of replacing one model of society with another one that valued control ownership and standardization over distributed expertise and long-term empirical understanding. And once you see that pattern, it becomes harder to look at these buildings the same way again, because what remains standing across Europe may not just be monuments to belief, but fragments of a system that understood something about the human body that we are only beginning to rediscover. What makes this difficult to dismiss is not theory but measurement, because the buildings are still there and the effects can still be observed, which creates a gap between what we can verify and what we are told these structures were for, and that gap is where the real question begins to take shape. Modern engineers can analyze the stone map. The acoustics measure the light spectrum and even identify the chemical effects of substances used inside these spaces, yet despite having tools the original builders could never have imagined, we cannot reproduce what they created, not at the same scale, not with the same consistency, and not with the same integration of multiple systems working together. This is not because the technology is beyond us, because in many ways we have far more advanced tools, but because the knowledge system that made it possible no longer exists in the form it once did, since it was never fully written down and was instead carried through direct transmission across generations, meaning that when the system that preserved it was dismantled, the knowledge did not transfer, it vanished. What remains is a structure that continues to function even after the understanding behind it has been lost, and this creates a situation where modern observers can measure the results without fully understanding the method, which is a reversal of how knowledge is typically built, because we usually understand the process before we achieve the outcome, but here the outcome survived while the process disappeared. This becomes even more striking when you consider that modern architecture, despite its precision and computational power, rarely attempts to influence the human body in this integrated way, because design has been separated into disciplines, acoustics handled in one field, lighting in another, environmental chemistry in another, and human physiology in yet another, while these structures appear to have combined all of those elements into a single coherent system. And that separation may be the key to understanding why we cannot replicate them, because the original builders were not working within isolated categories. They were working within a unified framework where geometry, material, sound, light, and human response were treated as parts of the same problem, refined through observation rather than divided through specialization. The more you look at these buildings, the harder it becomes to see them as passive spaces, because everything about them suggests interaction rather than symbolism, from the way sound moves through the nave to the way light shifts across the interior surfaces throughout the day to the way the environment itself changes the longer you remain inside it, which leads to a conclusion that feels increasingly unavoidable. Because if these structures were designed to produce measurable changes in the human body, and if that design was based on knowledge that was transmitted through systems that no longer exist, then what we are looking at today is not just architecture, but the remains of a lost methodology, one that operated effectively enough to be built at scale and maintained for centuries. And yet that methodology is almost entirely absent from modern historical explanation, replaced instead by narratives that focus on belief symbolism and power, which are not incorrect, but are incomplete because they do not account for the physical effects that can still be measured inside these spaces today. This raises a final question that is more unsettling than any of the others, because it shifts the focus away from the past and toward the present. And that question is not simply what these buildings were, but why the understanding of what they were capable of is no longer part of mainstream knowledge. Because if the effects are real, and if the design was intentional, and if the system that created it was dismantled during a period of political and economic consolidation, then the loss of that knowledge was not just a historical accident, it was a structural consequence of replacing one way of organizing society with another. And if that is true, then what we are left with today are not just cathedrals, but functioning artifacts of a system we no longer understand, structures that continue to do what they were designed to do, even as the explanation for how and why they do it has been reduced to something far simpler than the evidence suggests. Which means the real question is no longer whether these buildings were places of worship, because they clearly were, but whether that was their only function, or simply the part of their function that survived after everything else was removed. And once you start asking that question, it becomes very difficult to stop, because it leads to a possibility that changes how you see not just these structures, but the entire trajectory of knowledge itself. The possibility that something highly effective, highly refined, and deeply integrated was not gradually improved over time, but instead broken apart, simplified, and forgotten, leaving behind only the visible shell of what once was a far more complex system.